apart from many appearances on television and many universities and community centres, he has also co-founded the public discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative, a forum that promotes open dialogue and critical debate between thinkers, academics, politicians and public speakers. And secondly, we're going to hear from Arif Ahmed, who's reader in philosophy at the University of Cambridge and fellow at Andalusi and Keys there. He mainly works on rational choice, but also has an interest in religion and has debated this matter with some very prominent names. The names William Lane Craig, Tariq Ramadan, Rowan Williams may not be so well known to all of you, but they're very well known to me. I'm delighted that we've got both speakers with us. We'll have a presentation first from Abdullah, and then there will be a response from Arif, and then a 5-minute response from Abdullah, 5 minutes from Arif, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the Nottingham Student Union and the Atheist, Secularist and Humanist Society for inviting me here to speak. I'd also like to thank my interlocutor, Arif Ahmed, for attending today and facilitating this debate. Today's debate topic is quite a double-barreled one. Is God necessary to explain reality and provide a consistent basis for values? I intend to demonstrate that not only is it God necessary to explain reality, but also that no consistent basis for morals and values is possible without God. Let's start by mentioning a basic question. What is reality? And why does it need an explanation? Reality is simply the existence of finite and limited things as opposed to the existence of nothing. If nothing exists, then no explanation would be required. However, if something exists and it is limited and defined in extent, form and composition, it would need an explanation. And by explanation, we mean cause. So to explain the occurrence of something is actually to explain its cause. This constitutes the burden of explanation that is upon both theists and atheists and agnostics alike. Now, contrary to what is popularly believed, the method of exploring and mapping out tangible reality that we can sense, i.e. science, is not necessary to ultimately explaining this question, since the need to explain reality is just as much pressing to two goldfish whose entire universe is contained in a goldfish bowl as it is to humans who gaze up at the sky and extend their gaze only as far as has been traversed by light, limited by the speed of light and the age of the universe. We'd not be able to work this out outside of the universe, what created it, by merely studying the contents of the universe, any more than a goldfish would be able to work out what or made the goldfish bowl by studying the walls in the bowl or the number of pebbles and plastic seaweed in it. When we ask what creates something, we are actually asking what defined its form, limitations and characteristics. To define something, definis, in Latin means to met out its limitations and boundaries. Everything that has boundaries, limits, form and finitude was defined by something else, whether it's an external force or by the sum of its internal consistence and components. Put simply, we know for certain that if I was to hold a rock or pick any rock from the surrounding area, we would know that the rock had been created or made because it has a shape and a composition. It either defines itself before it existed, which is rationally absurd, or it doesn't have any limitations and is infinite, but then why would it have shape? The only conclusion left is that any rock we might pick or view was made by something else, whether a mindless process or a thing with agency. If a rock wasn't formed with cooling lava or meteorite strikes or weathering or by artificial hands, would it have any shape? No, because it wouldn't have been shaped or formed, and therefore it simply wouldn't exist. Likewise, reality with its dimensions and objects and their recurrent and consistent behaviors we call laws. We have to ask what ultimately defined or determined these properties that we observe. This is because we need an ultimate explanation for the sum total of finite and limited reality. There must be an ultimate explanation or cause, since it is rationally impossible for there to be an infinite regress of finite causes prior to our existence. As put simply, we'd never reach this moment in this infinite regress. If my journey from London to Nottingham today had taken an infinite amount of time and required I'll try to buy a car, required my car to traverse an infinite amount of distance, would we ever arrive in Nottingham? No. Likewise, we know that a changing universe had a beginning, because if it was eternal, we'd have to wait an infinite amount of time to reach any moment of existence. Consequently, this moment and all of us would never exist. Furthermore, what's the essence of the smallest particle? What's it made out of? Again, if there were an infinite series of Matryoshka doll or Russian nesting doll-like elements, no particles would ever exist. At some point, we have to concede that something is sustaining all matter and energy, whatever we mean by energy. Therefore, the only explanation that remains is that the ultimate explanation or cause of finite reality is that there is another reality in addition to our own, an infinite reality, opposite of finite reality, that gave rise to and currently sustains our reality. This force is infinite, unchanging, and without shape, rendering it the exact opposite of a finite thing, and therefore in need of nothing to define it, form it, shape it, or give it characteristics. This leaves us with a remaining question: is it mindless, or is it an agent? I.e., does it have will or intention? This infinite force, being the first cause, we deduce rationally, could not be compelled by any internal, external mechanism to create the universe and us. It follows that it intended to create our finite reality, and if it has intention, then it has will and could not be mindless. This reality, which is both without limits, finitude, or precursors, and which possesses intent, can be called anything you want. However, since we're speaking English, I'd like to suggest an English name for this, and that I think would best fit, and I think this would be called God. In light of this, we are rationally moved to conclude that God is necessary to explain our reality, or while the explanations fail to provide a rationally consistent alternative, and the individual who is dogmatically insistent on denying God, for whatever personal reasons bedevil them, is forced to simply deny either reality exists at all, or that we shouldn't believe in anything that can't be directly seen, despite the fact that they are happy to do so with much cognitive dissonance in every other area of their lives, including in the sciences. This is clearly evident by the fact that aside from agnostics, the idea of God is not even considered a plausible alternative explanation or theory by many professing to be atheists. And the idea that we can deduce things beyond what we can see by looking at the finite nature of anything that we do see is the basic premise of all thinking and the sciences. A geologist knows when they look at a rock that the rock has been created, as much as a layman looking at the same rock would also conclude that the rock was made by something else. And that's merely due to the rock not being infinite, but being a certain shape and form. This is what we call common rationality, and is the basis behind science. If you throw this out, then you throw out the basis of all science, thinking, and rationality. But furthermore, morality cannot exist without meaning and purpose. The existence of God and God's intended creation of all finite reality means, at the very least, that everything that exists in our finite reality was intended. This intention means that everything that exists and existed and will exist is intended and therefore becomes imbued with purpose and meaning. Words only have meaning because they have an intended signification or information behind what they convey. Likewise, our finite reality has meaning and intention behind it. This becomes significant as a basis for all other concepts of meaning. The purpose of a car defines its meaning. The purpose, as we know for cars, are transportation. If a car gets you from A to B, it is a good car. But if a car breaks down, it is a bad car. The concepts, or should I say the words good and bad, can only be understood by measuring an action according to whether it fulfills the intention behind the created thing. If humans were intended, then we now have a basis to measure actions as either good or bad. If humans are not intended, then our finite reality, and that our finite reality had inflationary constants and electromagnetic forces finely tuned to produce life as a matter of pure coincidence, which is a highly visible concept, then there is no good and bad because human life has no intention behind it, and the universe, or finite reality, has no intention behind it. The only good and bad in such reality is merely the possible and the impossible. Now, I'm not saying that this makes massacres, killings, rape, colonization, and exploitation become good. I'm merely pointing out that if there is no meaning to human life, it doesn't make these actions anything at all. The idea of human rights, or natural rights as they were first called during the so-called Western Enlightenment, was the idea that observing the universe built by the Creator could teach us the intention of the Creator for human beings, and therefore give us an idea of the natural rights that humans should enjoy. Jeremy Bentham declared the idea of natural rights to be nonsense on stilts, and argued instead for a utilitarian perspective where actions were only judged based purely by reference to the achievement of a desired goal by any human in question. Human desire then became the only measure of what is good or bad, and herein lies the problem. You see, it's not that atheists can, and no one's arguing that atheists cannot perform actions that would be considered moral by people who believed in divinely established natural rights. The observation I'm merely pointing to is that unless atheists embrace mental compartmentalization and hold on to dogmatically morals bequeathed to them from a religious legacy within their societies, or they don't question the mental conditioning their parents implemented on them to condition their adult behavior, they have no argument to justify or refute any desire they or anyone else possesses, whether it fits in with accepted social norms or goes outside them. What remains to atheists is not morality, but culture and childhood conditioning. However, today's debate is not about the intellectual justification for morals. It's actually about motivational consistency in morals, and it's about whether God is necessary to provide a consistent basis for values. So let's examine motivational consistency. Motivational consistency means that a moral standard possesses the ability to motivate someone consistently to live and behave by moral codes regardless of the situation or inconvenience. The trick here is to ensure that people act consistently with the moral code in like-for-like situations that do not depend on their personal convenience. Now, atheists or materialist moralists may argue that there might not exist a higher objective morality outside the material world. However, we can construct, based on a social contract, a type of list of morals by which we can establish society for the greater benefit of all. To wit, they play a game to construct society based on what is called lightened self-interests, and asks everyone to play by the same rules and allow everyone to achieve their common interests. But this relies on two assumptions. It assumes that everyone starts off with equal capability and equal starting positions, something that human realities just don't bear out. And it also assumes that the rules will never get in the way of people's interests, and that people will never be tempted to cheat or use shortcuts when they are confident no one is looking. What if the people playing this game were unequal players, and some could work the rules well enough to gain so much of their interests that others end up without attaining theirs? Like, for example, the wealth disparity we see in capitalism. Some people will have more wealth than others. Some people have more opportunity and connection. Some have more skill than others. Some are more attractive than others. Apparently, this individual in California, Elliot Rodger, was so frustrated at the fact that he couldn't get any girls that he decided to take out his wrath upon individuals on the street by killing women and men, or jocks as he calls them, because he believes that he was the perfect gentleman and he couldn't get women, and women were only the bad guys, and so he decided that was unfair, and so he decided to kill people based on what he considered to be unfair, and what he did was obviously grotesque. However, we have to look, what incentive did those people who see others getting ahead of them have to follow the rules that are clearly benefiting some people more than others? Furthermore, what about people who see that their interest may be reasonably obtained by cheating? In either case, we would expect materially motivated people to see it as wise to accept. So would we expect people who are materially motivated to see it as wise accepting losses in the service of a greater good? Well, the communists couldn't motivate people to do action for the greater good without profit incentive, despite the fact they threatened them with gulags and other such quote-unquote inducements. And look at what about in criminology? Criminologists have a concept or a model called rational choice theory, whereby they explain that many criminal activities are done because the criminal perceives it to be rational to attain their interests. People have often heard the saying, it's only a crime if you get caught, or rules are made to be broken. If our ancestors would go out for hunting, accepting that there would be risk in doing so in order to get a benefit, then why do we expect modern humans to not use, to play with risk to get their interests too? Especially if they feel they are disenfranchised, or that they feel that they couldn't, that they didn't want to work the 9-to-5 slog and they want to get rich quickly. People would argue, well, if everyone did that, society would collapse on itself, and who could countenance or justify that action when if everyone was doing it, society would collapse? But here's the assumption. You can break the rules without society collapsing. You can break the rules, you can cheat, you can lie, you can defraud. If no one catches you, then society doesn't collapse. Heck, even if you do the crime, you're caught, society doesn't collapse. So arguing that people would abstain from doing bad actions because society would collapse and therefore the common interest would be against that is not really kind of seen in actual practice. We also see that people might have self-interest without any consequence. For example, some rich capitalists might be okay to pollute the world and make more profit because, heck, it's not them that's going to live in the polluted world in the future. So they don't see any consequence in their lifetime, and they don't see much motivation to prevent or to not take advantage. What about belief in justice? I would actually argue the concept of justice has killed more people than any other concept. Just the word justice itself has killed more people than any other concept in human history. And envy and jealousy between people arise because people believe that we are all equal. So if someone is richer, or is more attractive, or is more intelligent, you see envy and jealousy rise amongst people. And many experiments have shown that when people are playing a game, and some people are getting ahead in that game, that people will expend resources to actually undermine their competitors in that game, to actually undermine each other. And many experiments have shown this. So how do you get rid of this? You can't, because nature exists in natural inequalities. You can't get rid of them. And what about if you're a powerful nation against weaker nations? What could you argue against American colonialists to not colonize the New World? You couldn't argue anything against them. They got away with it. What about those who colonized Australia? They got away with it, and they benefit from it, and their descendants benefit from it, and there's nothing you could argue against them because they had no consequence to their actions. In fact, human history is a litany of tribes oppressing other tribes because it doesn't destroy their own society by attacking other countries around the world. And so they do it because they might have a benefit in it. They see it as a benefit, resources, land, territory, and they pursue that benefit without consequence. But just to kind of bring it in, which I'll kind of conclude, we also see that if you base ideologies around human convenience, and you base rights around human convenience, well then the God of human convenience giveth, and the God of human convenience taketh away. We saw debates in America about torture, whether torture should be legalized. Well, not legalized, sorry, it shouldn't be prohibited. Because they said if it saves lives, why not, is the argument. And the debate was whether it works or not that it goes against people's natural rights, because as Jeremy Bentham said, natural rights is nonsense on stilts. So then the only argument you could ever bring is, does it work? Doesn't it work? We see secular kind of tolerance only applies when it's convenient. But we see both John Locke writing in his book, ironically titled A Letter on Toleration, John Milton, as well as many others, talk about that you do not tolerate minorities where you can't be sure that they are loyal to the state. They don't have a right of toleration. You shouldn't tolerate these minorities. And you see that throughout European history, post-Enlightenment, minorities have repeatedly been subject to suspicion, persecution, and oppression because they were perceived to be a threat to our civilization, to Western civilization. Heck, even my colleague here, Arif Ahmed, described the Islam as the greatest political threat in the West today, constituting a global threat, and it represents an extreme threat to our life in the West. So then what do you do with a Muslim minority if you think Islam is a threat to the West? Well, rationally speaking, you would limit a minority if you think they were truly represented, or they followed an ideology which truly represented a threat to your civilization. And the same was said about the Jews, and the same was said about the Catholics prior to that. We've seen this repetition in the so-called post-Enlightenment, secular tolerant West. Because rights are only as good as they are convenient. When you get rid of natural rights. We see Sam Harris, actually another atheist, who justified the possibility of torture if it saves lives. We see John Rawls, famous secular liberal John Rawls, argued that he called it the supreme emergency exemption. He said there are occasions when you can bomb civilians, target civilians, if you reckon you will win, it will help you win the war. And he cites World War II as his paradigm. You can't say John Rawls is a fringe liberal. You can't say it. He's actually paradigmatic as a secular liberal. Of course, one could also argue that why tolerate religious belief if religious belief is false consciousness, as the communists argued, and that religion is dangerous. Many atheists argue that religion is dangerous. So then why tolerate it? Because the idea of freedom is a metaphysical idea, it's not a physical idea. So where is the basis if it's no longer convenient to offer freedom? Which is why we see many states become more authoritarian when they're faced with terrorism or threats or what have you, or blown out of proportion, of course, because they can then justify to their people, we have to take these rights away because they're no longer convenient. That is the God of human convenience. Religion, on the other hand, offers inducements that are counterintuitive, forgiving enemies, forgiving those who trespass against you, believing that God will right wrongs and will ask and account those people who've been given more in this life. Don't get jealous, because God will ask more to those who've been given more. So everything balances out in a hereafter. We see that, and this is the point what I'm trying to make, is not that religious morality is compatible with secular liberalism, and we're going to probably hear this discussion that many religious beliefs are not compatible with secular liberalism. I don't really care about compatibility with secularism at all whatsoever. My only argument is consistency. And we see that religious morality, at least with some religions, has greater potential to offer a more consistent set of morals because these morals are based on divinely inspired or divine morals and ethics which are not subject to human convenience. Whereas if you base morality on human convenience, well, then that can change, and it does frequently change. The universe is chaos. Therefore, any morality born of materialist ideologies would also be inconsistent, inconstant, and full of contradictions. If you make as your basis for morality human convenience, then what the God of human convenience giveth, then the God of human convenience can equally and as lightly taketh away. Therefore, if we are to have a consistent basis for values and morality, other than the capricious, mercurial vagaries of human convenience, then morality and values must be pinned or anchored on a basis that possesses objective existence, which can only be the intent of the will of a creator. This can only be God, and therefore God is not only necessary to explain reality, but provide a consistent basis for values. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Abdullah, for a stimulating talk. So I'll be talking for the next, maybe not quite as long as the previous talk, but I will be talking for about 10-15 minutes about some of the very interesting points that have been brought up in the last talk. First, I shall say a little bit about the argument concerning the necessity for God's existence as a means of explaining reality. Then I shall say something about whether we need God as a basis for values, and to remove all suspense. My answer to both of those questions is no. I'll start with the argument concerning whether we need God to explain reality. Now, the argument as I understood it from Abdullah was that, well, it relied on two premises, and one of the premises was that whatever is limited needs some sort of explanation as to how it got the way it did. And then the other premise is that reality itself is limited. From these two assumptions, it does follow that reality needs some sort of explanation. And then the next step was that the explanation has to be infinite, and it also has to have intention. That wasn't quite clear exactly how that step followed, but I will say a bit more about that. And then that was the thing that was defined for us as God. And then we moved on to the issue about values, which I'll come on to shortly. So just turning to those assumptions, first of all, that whatever is limited needs some sort of explanation. It might be what motivates that idea. I mean, I think that may be false, but what motivates that idea is the belief that nothing can be arbitrary, that the way things are, there has to be some explanation of why they are that way rather than some other way. Now, we're familiar in modern science with plenty of counterexamples to that kind of principle. So if you think, for instance, concerning quantum phenomena, let's say, why did this atom decay at this particular time rather than half a second earlier or half a second later? It's not just true, but it's part of the theory that there's no explanation for that. This is something that just happened. It was a finite limited event, and it just happened without having any particular causal explanation of why it happened then rather than earlier or later. Now, there's no reason in principle why that sort of arbitrariness shouldn't in fact arise at a much larger scale. So that the only answer to some questions about, for instance, why the laws of nature as they are, why is the universe exactly the way that it is, we can explain it in terms of more and more basic laws, but at some point we'll have to say, well, that's just the way things are, that's just the way reality is. If there is some sort of contradiction that follows from that assumption, then it would be interesting to know what it is. If there isn't any contradiction that follows from it, then I want to know what the premises are, what other argument we can give for this assumption that whatever is limited needs to have some sort of causal explanation. The next assumption, which was that reality itself is limited, was based on an argument which I've always found rather curious, which is that there can be no infinite sequence of events going backwards in time, because then we'd never have got to the present moment. That seems to have been the argument. To give you an idea of why this is wrong, just think about the analogy for space. Suppose someone said, space can't be infinite, because then how could you ever get to this place? Well, that seems wrong. So that's an interesting question why the argument should seem plausible for time, but not for space. Now think of another example. Let's think about an infinite sequence of events going forwards in time. There seems to be no difficulty in that. There seems to be no incoherence or possibility in having, starting from now, a sequence of events that goes on forever. Why then should the mere reversal in time turn perfectly reasonable possibility into some kind of incoherence? Well, I submit that it doesn't. And if the question is, if time started an infinite amount of time ago, how did we ever get to the present moment? That's a fallacy, because we never started an infinite time ago. There was no infinite amount of time ago. It's just for every finite number of seconds, there was something that many seconds ago. So there's no time at which you could point and say that moment was infinitely many seconds before the present moment. A third point, which is for a different reason, illustrates the falsity, I think, of this assumption. We can, of course, in principle, there's nothing to stop us from fitting infinitely many events into a finite amount of time. Again, anyone who knows physics can see this from the case which runs forwards in time. So if you imagine a very simple Newtonian model of a ball bouncing on a flat surface with a certain coefficient of elasticity, each bounce of the ball will take a certain, say each time the ball hits the surface, then bounces up slightly lower, and then bounces up slightly lower. Each bounce might take, let's say, 50% of the time of the one that preceded it. If the first bounce took 10 seconds, infinitely many bounces will have been completed in 20 seconds. Then we have infinitely many events taking place in a finite amount of time. Now, those laws are reversible in time. We can make a film of that sequence of events, play it backwards, and now there's nothing impossible about it, no incoherence at all. If there is an incoherence, perhaps Abdullah could tell us what it is. I'm not aware of any incoherence in that, or any difficulty in accounting for the universe in that way. One other point that I'll make about this is that, of course, even if we think that the universe is finite in time, as I guess people do, that the universe began between 13 and 14 billion years ago, there are theories according to which it wasn't just space that began at that moment, it was space and time. In fact, it's incoherent even to distinguish between space and time in the way that we customarily do. So that time itself began 14 billion years ago, and there was no time beforehand when nothingness was hanging around waiting for the universe to come into existence. There was no time before that point, 14 billion years ago. So again, no problem arises. There was no question as to what happened at the time before the universe began in order to bring it into existence. There was no moment when the universe didn't exist. The two assumptions of Abdullah's argument, as I said, were first of all that reality is limited. First of all that what is limited needs an explanation, and secondly that reality itself is limited. I'll argue that both of those assumptions are false. The step, even if we grant those assumptions, or grant that reality needs some kind of explanation, the step from those assumptions to the conclusion that the explanation has to be A, infinite, and B, possessed of intention, was, I'm afraid, completely opaque to me. I just don't see how it can follow, how that can follow. Let me say a little bit about what does count as a good explanation versus a bad explanation in areas with which we're familiar, so where we can distinguish what, explanation according to rational criteria. A good explanation of something is something that actually makes predictions that you wouldn't expect, which then turn out to be true. That's what a good explanation is. If you think about, for instance, the nuclear model of the atom versus the model of the atom in which charge was distributed uniformly across it, the nuclear model of the atom is a good explanation of what atoms are made of, if you want to put it in its true terms, because it explained what Thomson observed. It explained the deviation of charged particles. It made a prediction, which we then found to be true. Now, if this supposed explanation of reality, which is that it was created by an infinite being with intention, actually makes predictions about things that we haven't observed, and those predictions are borne out to be true, and other theories don't make those predictions, that's an argument for it. That would be a good explanation. So then my next question would be, can we hear one of those predictions, please? Otherwise, I see no reason to think this is remotely plausible. It seems a completely hopeless explanation of something which I submit didn't need to be explained in the first place. Let me move on now to the issue concerning values, and whether we need God to be the basis of values. There are various questions here that seem to have been tangled up in the preceding discussion, so I'll just say a little bit, but I've made interesting points about all of them, so I'll just try and disentangle them and then say a bit about why I think some of the things he said were false. You can distinguish, first of all, the question whether we need God to exist in order for there to be such a thing as moral conduct, from the question whether we need God to exist in order for there to be a distinction between right and wrong in the first place. Let me start with the first one, because I think Abdullah did talk about it towards the end of his discussion, when he said, incentivizing people in terms of self-interest or enlightened self-interest won't persuade them to act morally. But my own belief in divinity will, give them a reason to act morally, to persuade them to act morally. Well, first of all, it should be evident to everyone from, mainly from the plain facts of history, that there have been people, and there no doubt will continue to be people, who act morally without any belief in God, or certainly without any belief in anything like Christian, Jewish, or Islamic God. We can take plenty of examples from antiquity of people. I suppose Socrates is an example that might be contested, or if we take people who are not only enlightened people, but very profound ethical thinkers like Marcus Aurelius or Aristotle, Plato, there's a tradition not only of ethical action, but ethical thought, completely divorced from any religious form of belief. And that, of course, is a very rich tradition that goes on to this day under the name of ethics, and is a branch of philosophy. There's also, of course, plenty of evidence that in countries where people are more secular, the kinds of acts that none of us have any difficulty in distinguishing as virtuous as opposed to vicious, are more prevalent. So that, for instance, if you think of the countries with the lowest crime rates, the most homicide rates, let's say, in the world, if you look at those countries such as Switzerland, or Denmark, or Japan, none of these are religious countries. In fact, these countries, if anything, are marked by their strong tendency towards secularism. So again, there's plenty of evidence that moral conduct can exist, and these people presumably have motivations to behave morally that are quite independent of religious beliefs. So moral conduct can exist and be motivated quite independently of any belief in a divinity. Setting aside that point, it just seems odd to me that the sorts of motivations that belief in God provide could be said to be motivations for moral conduct. The sorts of motivations, the sort of incentive that Abdullah mentioned, well, in fact he mentioned two. The one he seemed to focus on was the motivation that involves self-interest. If one thinks one is going to be punished after one dies, or horrible things are going to happen to one after one dies, if you steal, or lie, or cheat, or murder, that you might refrain from murder, but you are not doing so out of a moral motive. Any more than someone who's trying to rob a bank and you put a gun to their head to stop them from robbing a bank. That doesn't make their refraining from robbing the bank some kind of moral self-restraint. That makes it a self-interested act. So the question is that people who, like all of you, and like all of us, who don't kill, and don't lie, and don't steal, Are we doing it out of a moral motivation, or are we doing it out of a self-interested motivation? If we are doing it out of a moral motivation because we respect other people, or because we love other people, or because we don't want to lie, be dishonest, or cheat, if we're doing it out of moral motivation, appealing to God adds nothing to that. It doesn't make you any more moral. And if you're doing it out of a self-interested motivation, then again, appealing to God doesn't turn a self-interested act into a moral one. It simply turns it into enlightened selfishness, kind of selfishness. The other sort of source of motivation that Abdullah mentioned for moral action was the intention of the creators. This is towards the beginning of this section of his talk, where he said that what makes something right or wrong is because it's in accordance with the intention of the person creator. Now, there's one difficulty with that is that we have to ask, where does this moral obligation come from? The obligation to do the thing that your creator wanted you to do. Is that an independent obligation that exists independently of God's will? In which case there can be moral obligations that are independent of his will. Or does it not? And if it doesn't, why are we obliged to obey it? Indeed, it seems a very suspicious thing to me in the first place to say that one's always obliged to obey the intentions of whoever it was who created one. I can see no basis for that. Certainly, my belief that it's wrong to steal and it's wrong to lie and it's wrong to kill people, the difference between honesty and dishonesty, the difference between kindness and selfishness, those differences are much more clear to me and much more clear to any atheist than is this rather dubious claim that one's always obliged to do what your creator intended you. The second sort of issue, which I think Abdullah did talk about briefly, and so I'll also talk about it briefly, was to do with whether belief in a divinity is something that is necessary for the existence of the distinction between right and wrong in the first place. Now here again, in some ways, some of the things I would want to say actually repeat what I've said earlier, so I won't dwell on it at great length. Instead, I'll just talk briefly about one very obvious objection to this idea that's been in existence for the last 2,000 years, which is that what is it that makes killing wrong? What is it that makes stealing wrong? What is it that makes lying wrong? Is it because God says it's wrong? Or is it the other way around? Does God tell us not to do it because it's already wrong? If it's the second, if God tells us not to do these things because they're already wrong, then again, the distinction between right and wrong exists independently of his will. If, on the other hand, and this seems the only alternative, we simply define right and wrong as whatever it is that God commands, then we seem to end up with a kind of absurd arbitrariness that distinguishes God in no way from any other despot. If he tells us that murder is wrong, that murder is fine, then murder is fine. If he tells us that these other horrible things, however horrible you want them to be, are permissible or even mandatory, then they are morally permissible or morally mandatory. The idea of defining what's right and wrong in terms of the command of a person who happens to be very powerful seems to be the very opposite of the spirit of morality, and to its credit, the very opposite of the spirit of religion itself. One of the great things that religion has done, I mean all religions, not just Islam, but also Christianity and Judaism, is that it has promoted in the individual opposition to authority, opposition to despotism in this world. And I have no time in general, for instance, for the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church did a great service to the human race in Poland, for instance, during the Cold War, when it motivated people to resist the murderous regime there. Let me say finally one other thing concerning what Abdullah said about my views concerning Islam in particular. Yes, I do think that there are many things in Islam that are contrary to values that I hold most important. But I certainly would reject the implication that I think intolerance is the best response to that. I think the best response to that, as it is with any serious view that I regard as incompatible with my own values, is to give it the freedom to speak and the freedom to promote its views wherever it wishes, and to argue against them. And that's what I've tried to do tonight. Thank you.